I'm not here because of drugs. I'm here because of human rights.
Welcome to the Greener Grass podcast from BlueBird Botanicals. I'm your host, Lex Pelger. This week, I'm pleased to announce the start of a new series. The series will focus on women in the cannabis world, and it's based on the excellent new book by Amy Piccirillo called Breaking the Grass Ceiling: Women, Weed, and Business. It features the story of 21 women in the cannabis world, and it's great to see a book talking about the females who work and grow this old female plant. When we reached out to Amy for an interview, she was kind enough to say yes right away, and it turned into a great conversation. But we won't be starting with her interview this week, but instead we'll talk with another one of the powerhouse women that Amy features in her book, because she has a great event coming up just after this show airs. I first interviewed Betty Aldworth 5 years ago while doing research for my graphic novel series on cannabis. That day, like today, we met in Denver for our talk. But last time, she was at the office of the National Cannabis Industry Association. It was there that she organized the Women's Cannabis Business Network, which eventually branched out and gave rise to the Women Grow Network, founded by Jane West, another person featured in the book. But from her work at the NCIA, Betty was asked to head one of my very favorite organizations, Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Betty will talk more about their work in the show, but I can say that in my years covering the drug world, nobody pumps out more fiery young activists than SSDP. That's why it was especially kind of her to grant us an interview with just a week to go until their big national conference in Washington, D.C. So if anybody out there listening can make it to the nation's capital this weekend, you can attend one of my hands-down favorite drug conferences that I've seen anywhere in the world. It's wonderful to see all these young people who will change the world, mixing it up with their advisors and mentors and fellow travelers who are invested in helping SSDP to do all their activism work. It's a great conference, and even if you can't make it, search to see if there might be an SSDP chapter in your neck of the woods, and go check out an event. It'll be inspiring, to be sure. So until then, here's Betty. This show is brought to you by BlueBird Botanicals, to spread education about cannabis and other things on the greener side of life. BlueBird CBD oil comes from farms in southern Colorado and is grown using only water, soil, and sunlight. Go to bluebirdbotanicals.com for more info. We are here with Betty Aldworth of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Thanks so much for taking time, especially before your big giant conference coming up.
I'm really excited to have the chance to chat about this, Lex.
Yeah, thanks. And it's been a lot of nice years. It was actually in Denver years ago that I met you when you were with NCIA, I believe.
Probably if it was in 2013. Yeah. Oh, in fact, yeah. I remember our first meeting up in what used to be the Vicente Cedarburg offices, where we rented some space from NCIA. And
yep.
I had that tan office with the peaked roof.
Yes,
yeah.
And that beautiful skylight.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then just watch you moving on up from there.
Yeah.
So now you're heading the largest student anti-drug war movement around. How did you get into this? How did this start becoming a passion for you?
I have long understood that the best approach to drug problems in communities is a harm reduction approach. That's something that I learned almost 20 years ago when my sister was working with the sex work organization. And when someone's experiencing a chaotic relationship with drugs, that's a health problem, not a criminal justice problem. And my work in marijuana was, sort of informed by that, but much more informed by the idea that, or at least at the beginning, by the idea that patients ought to have access to medicine that works for them. But as I got to learn more about it, all of these things sort of unfolded for me in terms of the depth and breadth of the influence of the war on drugs on our policies writ large, and just how much the war on drugs influences the various social issues that I care about: racial justice, mass incarceration, economic injustice, and the ways that we marginalize communities. The drug war is the most important hammer in that toolbox, right? And so when I had the opportunity to make the leap from working on just marijuana policy to broader drug policy in general, I took it in a heartbeat, especially since it was with Students for Sensible Drug Policy, which is such an amazing organization of young people. But I love working with the students because as much as the drug policy reform movement is a forward-looking movement, young people are always going to be 10 years ahead of the rest of us. So this is like the future of a futuristic movement, and that's really fun. But also, young people don't really have a sense of the impossible. They haven't figured out yet that like the world's going to be a lot harder to move than you think. And so they're coming into this work with a sense of clarity and ideological alignment and purpose that is unpolluted by the world just yet. Like not, and it's, I don't mean to sound utterly naive. I know that for many of our members, they've been through a lot, but they are more likely to have a strong sense that they can actually change the world. And that's what it takes to get it done. Right. And I really, I align and identify with that very strongly. I still believe that to be true for myself. So I want to surround myself with people who agree.
It's great. Harnessing that energy. I remember an old shaman saying, of course the kid's wrong in these giant dreams, but he has to dream them. It's necessary for all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that is what gives us something inspirational to move toward, I mean, there's, I think that, particularly in this moment where we see young people standing up across the nation, no matter how it is that we might feel about gun laws and the discussion around that, here in the week after the Parkland shooting in Florida, we see that the dialogue is actually finally changing. It's not just the same old routine. The conversation is sticking in the media. We're continuing to talk about, the shooting, gun rights, the problems in our, with toxic masculinity and the ways that we approach the Second Amendment, which I think that, we can basically all agree that even if we take very different approaches to how to fix it, we clearly have a problem when school shootings are as common as they are now, and other mass shootings. We need to be having this conversation as a nation. We've always let it slip to the back burner. We've always been, complained about the thoughts and prayers and then not continued the dialogue, but we're continuing the dialogue now. We are having the conversation 9 days later, and I believe that we will continue to be having the conversation for quite some time. And that's not because the grown-ups are doing it. It's the students. It's the students standing up.
That's true. And you've been seeing the same thing in the dialogue around the war on drugs since you've been in the movement, getting it seen from an issue that is just so off the table to something that now is being talked about as one of the great mass ills. I mean, what's that been like to watch for you?
It's been really interesting. My early work in this space has been was around media and public relations and community relations. So really, like, focusing on changing the way that we talk about things. My very first job in the space was trying to convince people that potency and purity testing for cannabis mattered for patients, right? Like, this was a long time ago. Yeah, I know. Everybody's like wanting to know what the terpene and cannabinoid profiles are now. 9 years ago, nobody cared. We couldn't convince anyone that it mattered what was in their cannabis, and really struggled in the beginning to have that conversation. So like that particular conversation around like cannabis as a product has evolved so much. The conversation around incarceration and the other social ills of cannabis prohibition has changed very dramatically. We're really talking now much more about the public health outcomes and tax revenue than it boggles my mind that the biggest conversations that we have in the national dialogue around cannabis are around the economics of it. That's very surprising to me. Although it shouldn't have been, but it is. Capitalism is far more powerful than I even realized. But, I think that the thing that is most heartening to me is that we're really having a serious and thoughtful and oftentimes evidence-based discussion around, the use of more stigmatized drugs and how we save people's lives in this overdose crisis. I think that there's obviously a lot of conversation that still doesn't meet those qualifications, but we are surely having a more elevated dialogue about that now, about more stigmatized drugs and the people who use them, who are also more stigmatized. I think that it offers us incredible opportunity to change the way that we're really approaching this.
And as you started towards this, how did your own relationship to drugs and what you saw going on around you affect your approach and your interest?
Yeah, when I first started in marijuana policy, I had actually quit using marijuana for 5 years, and the only drugs I was using were alcohol and caffeine. And I was one of the very many women who in their late 20s have, some sort of biochemical shift where marijuana causes anxiety more often than not. So I couldn't smoke it anymore. At that point, I was really not a user, but compelled by the medical promise. And through my work at the lab, I figured out that, actually, it's about the cannabinoid content. And yes, I can use cannabis and I can use it medically and socially and, as part of my wellness routine. And that was a really wonderful eye-opening experience. I've deeply appreciated bringing cannabis back into my life. Since then have, for most intents and purposes, stopped using alcohol, although caffeine is still my best friend.
You gotta be addicted to something. I sincerely believe.
Right? I quit sugar 8 months ago. I know. That was the one drug that was really in charge, right? I was not in charge of my relationship with sugar. Whether or not you want to think about it as a drug, I was not in charge of that relationship. And I fixed that, so it's really good.
Mazel tov. That's cool.
Thank you. I'm not fully abstinent. Every once in a while, I'll have a bite of something, but that's okay.
What was it like for you to be coming into this, specifically the drug space versus the other worlds you've worked in? How has it been different being a female warrior here against the drug war?
Yeah, I've actually spent a good part of my life in male-dominated spaces. I audited classes and lived in a community during my early college years at a place called Deep Springs in Central Eastern California, absolute middle of nowhere, community of 50, 26 students, and as of today, all male. And I'm super, super pleased to say that Deep Springs is currently accepting and evaluating its first co-ed class, inviting young people of all genders. And so the next class will include men, women, and those who don't identify on the binary. But I lived for 2 years in a community that was primarily male, and during formative years, 17 to 19. So I really had an opportunity there to sort of figure out how to navigate male spaces, and how to do so from a place of power, which was really incredibly helpful, as it turns out, when I came into drug policy reform in the marijuana world, because as much as medical marijuana is full of women, it is also the case that the policy movement and the cannabis community at large has been a fairly male space. I'm not going to surprise anybody listening when I say that, for most of its history. And so between that and my experience in nonprofits, which are decidedly not so, for a lot of different reasons, nonprofits tend to be administered by women. And those are lots of socioeconomic reasons that we don't need to dive into now. But having those two experiences gave me an orientation around how I go about my work and interactions with people that sort of allow me to manage and minimize gender bias oftentimes. Not perfectly by any means. It still happens to me. It happens to everybody, right? We know that. And particularly in this moment where lots of people are talking publicly about their experiences, of course, in the workplace, in personal relationships, I have oftentimes found myself in positions where I feel like I felt like I have allowed a gendered interaction to marginalize my involvement. And that's entirely separate, of course, from incidents of harassment or assault, right? Like that's just gendered interactions in the workplace. And I want to be real clear about that. But that's been a little bit easier for me to manage. So I can go to the founding group of SSDP, which is like 20 dudes and Amanda Ryman, and still hold my own space. And that doesn't feel uncomfortable to me, and that's something that I feel, entirely equipped for.
And so as someone who teaches so much to students, what advice do you often give to young women who want to make a difference in this hard world of activism?
I would say that the most important things for anyone trying to create change is to be full of integrity and unapologetic about it, right? Like, be fierce, be integral, be kind. Those are the most important things.
That's great.
Thanks.
And it's great advice for everybody. And it's part of the reason that I think SSDP is such a powerhouse of an organization, is because you're instilling these values into young people who have so much energy. They work with SSDP through the college years, maybe even some after, and then they start these organizations. And I've just run into so many organizations that are a couple of people. They're all SSDPers, and they are working on one part of the drug war or some other kind of activism. And what's it been like for you to take over this helm and to start fostering these activist warriors going out there?
It's really great to watch. Like in my time at SSDP, there have been all sorts of organizations started by SSDPers that I've seen. And, SSDPers were made up most of the founding group of psychedelic club and societies. The SSDPers have started This Week in Drugs, the awesome podcast that I hope all of your listeners are also enjoying. They started Drug Story, which is a fully searchable, taggable database of drug experiences so that people can, interact with other people's experiences a little more easily and readily and learn from that as a harm reduction approach. And then the Minority Cannabis Business Association has been incredibly heavily influenced by SSDPers. There are SSDPers on the board. They're running the policy processes. They're, terrifically influential in that group as well. And it's really amazing to see all of these people influencing the way that we are approaching the future, just like they did when they were in college, but now with like a little more freedom and a little more knowledge about how to navigate the world, and like some more opportunity to take their learnings from being an SSDP in college and turn that into and apply that to the world outside college in new ways. It's really great.
Yeah, it just seems like such a great place to learn about new tools. And so for
it occurs to me, and I know this, I don't know why I didn't say it, but like most of those people who I just referenced, many of them, not all, but well over half of them are young women. And that's a really exciting thing too. When we're talking about like SSDP and the ways that it's influencing the future of the reform movement, one of those ways is that we are remarkably diverse by a lot of different measures. We've got members from 28 different countries, or in 28 different countries now. We have members across the gender spectrum, but people who identify as men, only make up 48% of our membership, so less than half. And in our leadership, in particular, we have extraordinary gender and ethnic diversity, and that's a really exciting thing, to bring more voices, to lift up more voices in the movement, so that we are a reform movement that is representing the voices of the people who are most impacted.
And it also impressed me how early SSDP was talking about gender pronouns and issues like that. Simply at the end of emails to have a statement and preferred pronouns. You were one of the first organizations I saw anywhere doing something like that, which was very impressive.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, we tend to be fairly quiet about it. We're not going to like get out there trumpeting that like, hey, like we're way ahead of everybody else, but we kind of are, right? Like the pronouns including pronouns in our email signature. That was just a very, it was a no-brainer. It was a way to signal that like we welcome people of all genders into our organization, and we like that is the sort of people who we are, and to be able to signal that to people who for trans folk, they have spent their entire lives being marginalized, and we want them to know that they're welcome with us.
Yeah, it makes sense, that foment of young energy, and because for me, of all the drug conferences I go to, SSDP is just some of the most energetic, vitalizing of anywhere I go, and the conversations are happening, and they're all over the place, and they're respectful, but they are not always in agreement, and people really learn how to suss out what matters to them.
Yeah.
And you can see the tools really being formed. And so I was wondering, for someone out there who might be listening, who wanted to start a chapter for themselves, or what does the mechanics look like? How independent are the units if you started your own chapter at a university?
Yeah, so we define ourselves as a grassroots network. It's really important to us that students are able to sort of, define their own destiny. What I mean by that is that, we provide tools, resources, and network. We provide connection into the broader drug policy reform community. We provide sort of translation between the desires of an individual chapter or young people working in their community and the broader theory of change that's guiding this international movement, right? Because every single chapter, every single unit of SSDP is part of this broader movement. And like, we want to create the connective tissue between the chapters and this great big global movement of tens of thousands of people who are working all over the world. But we really like the most important part of coaching that we do, the most important resource that we provide is like helping people identify what the most urgent drug-related issues are in their community that they feel passionate about and are able to address, and then helping them develop a pathway for addressing them, right? So, we do certainly, of course, run national and international campaigns. There are times when we're heavily focused on a particular thing. For example, we're headed to DC right after our conference to do a lobby day where we're going to be talking about the Higher Education Act and how people with drug offenses are still losing access to financial aid. We're going to talk about the RAVE Act and how it is still the case that venues are not engaging, evidence-based harm reduction approaches to nightlife drug use because they're afraid of the federal government cracking down on them for having a drug-involved premises. And we're going to talk about the Marijuana Justice Act. But those are things that everybody in our network can agree on, right? Like, if you're with us, you believe that these things are wrong, basically. And so we can align around these big ideas. But when it comes to figuring out what you want to work on in your own community, that is really about like what's going on for you as a chapter and what's going on your campus or in your state. So maybe it is that you want to join us as we legalize marijuana in Michigan with our allies. Cool. We love that. Yes, absolutely. Let's activate young people around that idea this year. That's a really important thing. Maybe you want to start a conversation about SIFs in your community, safe injection facilities, so that people, are able to access harm reduction, in safe spaces and avoid overdose and medical issues by injecting in spaces where they have resources. Maybe you want the officers on your campus to carry naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal drug. Maybe you want the health center to offer drug checking so that people know what's in their drugs before they take them, since 80% of MDMA on the market is adulterated. Like any of those issues, the broad swath of issues related to drug policy, the criminal justice issues that are related to it, the social justice issues, the public health issues, the liberty issues, all of it. You decide what's most important to you in your community, and we're going to help you get there.
It almost feels like deploying a swarm of people working all these different directions and doing the attack in all these different directions.
Yeah.
And for someone out there wanting to support SSDP, what would be the most helpful things?
Sure.
In terms of donations and time and things like that.
Yeah, let me actually, as to your first question, if you go to our website at ssdp.org and like click start a chapter, you can start a chapter on your campus. Anybody can do that around the world. There might even already be a chapter on your campus that you can help join and guide and participate in, because just as we are grassroots, the chapters are like democratic groups of people who make decisions together. So, you can join and influence your chapter even if it already exists. For those who would like to support SSDP, we are a super scrappy, bootstrappy organization, and
Amen.
We're we take that very seriously, but it still takes money to get this work done, right? We've got 9 folks on staff who are supporting these 300 chapters and the hundreds of policy initiatives that are undertaken every year. One of those people is Dr. Vail-Marie Narlock, who's our drug education manager, who is training up 120 students right now to deliver drug education on their campuses. Yeah, I know. It's great. Wow. Like, there's just so much going on at SSDP. And we're cheap about it, but it still takes money. So obviously, financial support is always a really, it's the easiest and best way to help in a lot of ways. You can also reach out to your local chapter, and, if you have expertise in an issue that they might be interested in, if you feel like you can engage with that chapter while being, respectful of the notion that like young people are in charge around here. That's we welcome people to get in touch with the chapter, help them with their efforts, go and give a talk or whatever it might be. That's a wonderful way to interact with SSDPers on the ground. And then we also, we engage lots of folks in our work on the day-to-day, whether it's getting the word out about our work, about whether it's supporting these policy initiatives that we're concerned about, whether, whatever it might be. So I would definitely encourage, for those people who want to be a little more engaged than just sending in a donation, which please do that too. But for people who want to be a little more engaged, like get on our mailing list and check us out, see what we're about, see what you're passionate about, and, help us contribute to our resources, build out the amazing network that we have, and join these young people in their work.
Yeah, amen. It's for people who aren't students, it's a really fun place to be around, and you can help make a difference with some of the things you learn. Like you said, as long as you remember who's in charge here.
Yep,
but
absolutely.
It's nice to see so many of the next generation come in SSDP conferences just because they like being around it and they help in their way.
Oh, absolutely,
It's beautiful to see how much mixing happens with a student organization.
This is the most intergenerational time of my life, I think. Like it's actually really cool. We have SSDP's very grandfather, Eric Sterling, who,
my favorite Quaker.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe my favorite person. Eric has been a longtime advisor. He worked, in the Judiciary Committee in the 80s, and he predates SSDP. His college experience predates SSDP by like decades, right? He sits on our board of directors, and he gets the nickname Fairy Godfather for a reason, and he'll be at the conference. And then we'll have our, a very significant number of our alumni corps there from every cohort of SSDP, from the entire 20 years of our history. And then our youngest SSDPers who are in high school right now, and everybody comes together in this really respectful place where, again, like we know who's in charge. We know who's in charge next. And, even the students in college now, or the recently graduated students, are looking to those high school chapters, knowing that those are the next leaders.
And just 2 more before I let you get back to the conference craziness. Mm-hmm. What in the future is coming up that's exciting right now for you and the organization?
There are some exciting things for us happening internally that will show. But what they're really going to be doing is setting us up for what comes next. And what comes next is a real conversation about all drug decriminalization and how we're going to really stop using the criminal justice system as a cudgel against the community of people who use drugs, no matter what those drugs are. And that's the place that I want to get us. That's where I want us to be in a handful of years here. And that's going to take us starting to do that work now, right? And yes, of course, we will continue to keep our focus on marijuana policy reform. We are going to continue to prepare ourselves for the next Congress, when we hope that we'll be able to really influence the way that cannabis policy is helped. And maybe in the next Congress, we actually could see something like the Marijuana Justice Act passed. We're going to continue to lay the groundwork, because it is all groundwork. None of this happens, overnight. It's all a matter of people working over the course of decades to get it done. And so we will continue to keep our eye on the marijuana ball, if you will. But we are really starting to think about what comes next and get ourselves ready for that. And I'm really, really thrilled to start digging in on that.
That's perfect, and leads into my last question really nicely. If you were one of the major policy advisors selected by the federal government to put into place how this decriminalization of all drugs would look, what are the most important aspects of that you would make sure has to be in that set of laws and regulations?
Yeah, first and foremost, it really needs to be centered in human rights and harm reduction, right? I'm not here because of drugs. I'm here because of human rights. And as I said at the beginning or earlier, the drug war is used as a tool to undermine human rights in communities, not just in America, but across the world. And we have an opportunity to completely reshape that if we can just pull our heads out of the war on drugs, right? If we can just stop thinking that demand reduction is going to actually change supply, that supply reduction is going to change demand. If we can stop thinking that demand reduction happens by throwing people in prison, if we can start taking evidentiary approaches to that, and return to a place where we think of drug users as human beings who deserve rights, then I believe we will be able to fundamentally transform the way that we address drugs and the people who use them in our communities. So that's those would be the two most important guiding values in that I would bring to that kind of work. And then I would call a lot of the people who are smarter than me, who I've been working with for almost a decade now on this, and make sure that they were involved too.
I hope to see it come to pass.
Oh, me too. That would be great. That would be great.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and for all the good work getting these warriors out there.
It's always such a pleasure. Thanks for the conversation, Lex.
All right. Thanks. Until next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Greener Grass is a BlueBird Botanicals podcast. Their CBD oil supports a healthy body and a strong endocannabinoid system. They've got friendly customer service who can answer any of your questions, and the number is right there at the top of their webpage. But, per the FDA, they won't be able to make any medical claims for these nutritional supplements. That's also the reason you'll hear little about CBD on this show. There's no need for us to add more evidence about CBD when a simple Google search will give you more than you can read in a month of Sundays. So this show covers the cannabis world and more with editorial freedom from BlueBird Botanicals. Thanks for joining the Greener Grass podcast. As always, our audio alchemist is Matt Payne. The Gypsy Jazz theme music comes from Brett Van Donsel. Our beautiful bird sounds are courtesy of Lang Elliott. And I'm your host, Lex Pelger, wishing you a bright green day.